Robert L. Harper.
Okay, and the L stands for?
Lyndon.
Robert Lyndon Harper. And when were you born?
July 6, 1934.
Okay. So tell us where you grew up and a little bit about your family.
Well, I was born and raised on a farm out near the village of Leggett, and my father was a farmer. He had infantile paralysis when he was a teenager, and that left him with some disability where he was paralyzed somewhat on his right side. So he had no grip or very little strength in his right arm and everything. So I don't know if he was naturally left-handed, but he had to become left-handed.
Yeah.
And so that's where I was born and raised on up, and went to high school in the village of Leggett for a while. And then some of us commuted to Rocky Mount Senior High, and that's where I graduated from high school.
So the farm, what crops did your father engage with?
Well, the major ones, tobacco was a money crop back then, cotton, peanuts, corn, the whole 9 yards.
So, and did you have siblings?
I have one brother, and he's 2 years older than I am, and he passed away about a year and a half ago.
Okay, so you grew up on a small farm, worked with your dad in the farming community, and graduated from Rocky Mount High School.
That's correct.
After high school, what did you do?
Well, my parents wanted me to go to college right out of high school, but I knew I wasn't ready, and so I declined to do that. I said, give me a while yet. A friend of mine, his parents made him go, and he managed to flunk out of 2 colleges in 1 year. Yeah. So maybe I was correct in what I did. So what I did after that is I weighed tobacco for a tobacco company here in Tarboro. They also had a tobacco outfit down at Hazelhurst, Georgia.
Now, what was the name of that company? Do you recall?
Well, the owner of it was Sam McConkey and Slim Johnson. That was their names.
Oh, wow.
And it's Clark Tobacco Warehouse, I believe it was.
So you actually helped to weigh the tobacco?
Yeah, I weighed tobacco. I would go down to Georgia and weigh tobacco down there. You sit in a little booth, and the scales is all there and everything, and you make the weight of the tobacco and everything. Somebody else grades it. And I did that the first season. And then between seasons, I did it for 2 seasons. Between seasons, I went to Rocky Mount Municipal Airport and got a job there for very little money, but free flying lessons.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And so I soloed when I was 18 years old, either 17 or 18.
Let's clarify one thing for people that may not be that familiar with tobacco. You were weighing tobacco, and it was being graded so that it could be auctioned.
Correct.
And in those days, there were many tobacco auction houses.
Correct.
So the first step was to see how much there was, because it's sold by the pound.
Right, that's right.
You weighed it up. Another person graded it. It was laid out in a tobacco warehouse, auctioned off to the highest bidder, the tobacco companies.
Correct.
And so you were the first, after it was picked and dried, you were kind of the next step that process.
That's right.
So you did that for 2 years.
Did that for 2 years, and in between those 2 years, that's when I took flying lessons and worked over there for the Rocky Mount Municipal Airport, and for very little money, but free flying lessons. So I soloed when I was either 17 or 18.
Wow. Wow. So you enjoyed flying?
I enjoyed flying, and I was hoping that it would be in part of my career for a long time, but that didn't work out that way.
Well, there was a lot going on at that time, but one of the things that was going on was the draft.
Right.
And so for young men of that age, you had 2 choices. You could either face the option of perhaps getting drafted, or you could enlist. Tell us what you decided to do.
I did a kind of a middle of that. I wanted to serve my country, and I wanted the adventure of it. But I didn't want to be in for 3 years. I preferred to be in for 2 years.
So if you got drafted, it was 3 years.
If I got drafted, it was 2 years. If I joined, it was 3 years.
Oh, okay.
So I went down, got a friend of mine, and I said, well, let's go down to the draft board. I want to go on in the Army. And so we went down to the draft board and said, put our name at the top of the list.
Really?
And so that's how I went into the Army. I was 19 years old at that time.
Wow.
And so basic training was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And that was, then the next was quartermaster school at Fort Lee, Virginia. And after that, it was pretty much on your way to Korea.
So the Korean conflict was going on, and after they, as they do in the service, ran you through a battery of tests to see what you were good at, you went to Korea.
And they said I should be in quartermaster.
Okay, now explain to everyone maybe that doesn't have a military background what that means.
Well, that's more or less supplies like uniforms and all kinds of supplies that are made for the troops in the battalions, etc. And so I was, when I first got to Korea, that was what I was in, quartermaster. And but they had a fire at where all of the supplies were stored. One night it got caught on fire.
Oh gosh.
And I was back in the barracks, and all of us were called out to go fight the fire.
Wow.
So we fought that fire just about all night, and so the fire won.
The supplies were lost.
Yeah, the supplies were lost, and it burned you out of a job.
Yeah.
So I no longer was in quartermaster. So
What did you do then? Yeah.
So I got tossed around for a while and ended up in the infantry.
Okay. Okay.
And that was when started in Busan, South Korea. And then after that, that's when that happened. And then I was in the infantry and went up to Daegu, was the next port. And up there, the assignment for the company was to, they had some communist prisoners, and they were held in that place, and where our job was to guard them. You never saw them; they were inside of a building.
Right.
But our job was to guard those, and because there were some South Koreans would have liked to have broken in there, and would. So the leader of South Korea at that time was not the best leader in the world.
I see.
And he really thought he'd like to restart the war so they could win it and take over North Korea, but that didn't happen.
So now, while you were in Korea, you had some R&R, rest and relaxation time, and you had the chance to go to Tokyo one time.
Went to Tokyo twice.
Yeah.
And that was, I enjoyed those two trips greatly.
Now, while you were in Tokyo, you did something interesting. You had an opportunity to record a message that you could send home to an acetate.
That's correct.
And you did that. Tell us, how'd you decide to do that?
Well, I don't know who made that decision, frankly, but we saw that where you could do that.
They had that technology.
Yeah,
right?
and it was myself and a couple other guys in my outfit, and we said, well, maybe that'd be a good idea to go in there and record a message that we can put on tape and mail it back to our parents, and they might appreciate it.
Yeah.
So that's what we did.
And someone made a comment to you while you were doing that.
Well, they did. When we got back to the barracks and played them back, someone said, Bob, you got a radio voice.
Oh, wow.
And of course, that didn't mean anything to me at the time, but apparently you file it back in your subconscious mind.
Yeah, it seems like everyone's voice never sounds the same to you or to them.
No, I had no idea what it sounded like.
Well, first time someone has told you you've got a radio voice, and it was kind of a precursor to some things to come that we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Sure.
But while you were in the service, you did, in your different jobs, have some experience with radio.
Well, that's correct. After I got in the service and got into the infantry can be pretty tough.
Yes.
And so that was okay with me, except I would like to have as good a job as I could. And I noticed these guys riding around in three-quarter ton trucks and Jeeps talking on microphones. And suddenly I said, well, that's the kind of thing I'd like to do. And so that's when I went over to talk to some of the guys that were in the infantry communications. And I had my pilot's license with me.
Yeah.
And just about everybody back then thought that the airplanes all had two-way radios on them. But the planes that I flew, which the little Piper J3 Cubs, did not have radios on.
I see. So when you were flying here in Rocky Mount and got your license,
Right.
There was no communication other than visual flight reference.
That's correct.
VFR?
That's correct.
Wow. Didn't realize that.
Well, I flew from Rocky Mount to Richmond, Virginia one time, and I was not supposed to land at Richmond, Virginia, but I had a headwind all the way up there, and so the little Piper Cub, you fly it from the back seat when you're by yourself to pick that makes it more balanced.
Right, for the nose. Yeah.
And I had a headwind all the way up there, and so when I got up, I was supposed to land at a smaller field. And they said, watch out for that small field because you don't want to land in bird field where all the airlines and military planes are coming in.
Right.
I never saw that small field.
Oh, okay.
And when the gas needle bumped on empty, I said, I've got to land this plane somewhere.
Yeah, get some fuel.
So I got in the traffic pattern in the bird field, and I didn't have a two-way radio on it. And so when you don't have a radio, you look for signs, kind of like traffic signs. Red, get out of the traffic line. Orange, stay in it, but don't land. Green, land.
Oh, wow.
And I never saw any of those. And so when the needle started bouncing on empty, I said, I've got to land this airplane.
Yeah.
And so I picked up where you always land into the wind and take off into the wind.
Yeah.
And so I found a runway that was not the main one where the airlines and military planes were landing. So I landed on that runway.
Because you didn't have a radio, you couldn't communicate with
That's
anybody.
right. And when I landed, almost as soon as I landed, I realized why nobody else was landing on it. There were potholes in there.
Oh.
And so my airplane, the left wheel, hit one of the potholes and buckled it.
Oh, gosh.
Not totally, but partially.
Yeah.
And so I taxied over to where I could get refueled and fly back, and went up to the control tower to let them sign my logbook to show that I got there. And I walked in there and gave them my logbook to sign. They said, "Where'd you come from?" And I said, "Well, I was flying that Piper Cub down there, write it down there." They said, "We never saw you." And so,
oh my gosh.
But they signed my logbook okay.
Yeah.
And then I got back on the airplane to fly back to Rocky Mount, and took off all right this time, but it was kind of like an angle.
Yeah.
And I flew back into kind of a headwind, and when I got back to Rocky Mount Municipal Airport, the gas needle was bouncing on empty again.
Oh my gosh.
But I landed okay back then, and of course when the owner of the airport took a look at how that
what had happened to his airplane?
yeah, okay. And when you did something like that, you would pay for it not with money, but they used to have a lot of crop dusters back then.
Yeah.
And there'd be a crop duster that had landed badly and have a wing. And so my penalty was to drive a pickup truck down, and they would load up a wing or a fuselage, and I'd bring it back. That was my punishment for doing that.
Well, you were an experienced pilot, and you took your pilot's license into the communications infantry office, and you told them you were interested in a job in communications.
Yeah, that's what decided that when I would bluff or otherwise lie, and because most people, when they saw a pilot's license, they automatically thought that you had some experience with operating radios.
Yeah.
Which of course I didn't, but they didn't know that.
Yeah.
And so I kind of bluffed or lied my way into the point where I managed to get into infantry communications.
Oh, wow.
And,
and you know, we see in the Korean War films and the World War II films for people that were not in the military, we see these radio units strapped on military personnel's backs. And in fact, you had some experience with that particular radio, which is called a PRC-10, but they had a nickname for it.
Yeah, it was called PRC-10. Of course, being GIs, we call them prick 10s. And those things, I guess they weighed, I don't know, maybe 80 pounds or
they're
whatever.
heavy.
But after you had them on your back for a while, you thought you had 150 pounds back there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, this is when I would be talking to someone on the two-way radio that was maybe a mile away or whatever distance it was. And on a number of occasions, they said, Bob, you have a radio voice. Again, I must have put it back in my subconscious mind because it didn't mean anything to me at that time.
Wow. So you did have some experience, at least in the communications division, but then January 1956, your military service ended and you came back to the U.S.
That's correct.
Talk to us a little bit about what happened then.
Well, I got back from Korea and didn't have any idea really what I wanted to do. But I knew then it was time for me to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I did. I went on and went to college, but before that, or about the same time, I met a young lady who was very pretty and very smart, and her name was Judy. And so we got married when I think, I was like 23.
Yeah.
And she was 19, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, we were married for 40-some years. And we had 3 children. First one was a daughter, Janice. And her and her husband live in Rocky Mount now. They had 1 child, which is my only grandchild. And she's now married just a few months ago. And then my second child was a son, Robert Keith Harper. We call him Keith, and he lives right here in Tarboro. And then my youngest was a daughter, LeClaire Ann Harper. We call her Lee. And she's been living in Phoenix, Arizona. But now she's in the process of moving back to North Carolina, around Concord, North Carolina.
Okay, and we have some interesting stories to tell about those kids and how they were involved in direct and indirect ways with what's going to come up next about your radio days. But let's talk about your college days. You attended East Carolina University.
That's correct.
And what did you intend to study?
Well, I started out majoring in social studies, which primarily was history. I was interested in history, and minored in English. I was interested in creative writing, and so that was my major. And I liked just 5 hours having a second minor in psychology, and all of that served me well when it came to my career, because they say, some of us are creative, some of us are analytical, some of us are kind of a combination of the three. But I was more creative, and my son's more analytical, and my older daughter, she was more creative, and my youngest daughter was kind of a combination of the two.
So that served you well. And while you were at ECU, you had an interesting experience in the fact you took a creative writing course by someone that was a published author.
Yeah, Ovid Pierce. He was the professor that I took creative writing under. And I enjoyed that quite a bit. And so I wrote some short stories. I still have a number of short stories, but the first one was published in the East Carolina literary magazine.
Well, even though you took creative writing, as you mentioned, you really had an affinity for history, and after you graduated from ECU, you thought you'd get a job teaching history.
That's correct. I thought that that's what I'd like to do, is teach history, and so I went to a number of high schools to see if they had any jobs open for a history teacher, and none of them did. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe I could have gone out of town somewhere, miles away, but yeah. I liked Tarboro, and I wanted to bring up the children in Tarboro, so I decided that I wouldn't be a history teacher.
Okay.
And that's kind of when, okay, what are you going to be?
Yeah.
What kind of job do you want? And that's when my subconscious mind answered me something about having a radio voice, and maybe you could get something in that. And so while I was in college, I went to the local radio station and asked them, did they need someone that they could hire part-time at night. Since I was going to college, I would be available at night. And they said they did. And so that's how I got started in radio, with part-time work at night. And then later on, after I graduated, and not being able to find. I'm digressing a little bit now, not in proper. But anyway, I couldn't get. I decided I won't be teaching history. So what will I do? And that's when I went down into the local radio stations and asked them about a job, and they had one in sales. So my first job in radio full-time was in sales, and I sold radio advertising in out of town, Wilson, Scotland Neck, Enfield, those places like that. And so apparently did pretty well, and then the general manager of the station, he went elsewhere, and then second general manager was having a tough time making out and doing things. So initially, I guess they got rid of him. I guess he was fired. But in any event, they was looking for somebody else to take his place as general manager. And they interviewed everybody, and the program director, Ed Conway, it was his name at that time, and he was offered the job. And he declined to take it, but he recommended me. And so they asked me, would I become general manager of the radio stations.
And you were 26 years old.
Yep,
You'd
that's
worked
correct.
at the station about 18 months, and now you find yourself as the general manager of the station. Now let's go back for just a second.
Sure.
These were the stations in Tarboro, licensed to Tarboro, WCPS-AM and FM.
Correct.
Now, at this time, we're talking about the early 1960s.
Correct.
People didn't know what to do with FM stations. In fact, I believe you simulcast the signal onto both stations at that
Yep,
time.
actually the AM and the FM broadcast the same thing.
Exactly the same thing.
Well, that's right.
They knew that there was probably some value to the license in the early 60s, but the big dog, the one that everybody listened to, was the AM station.
That's correct.
And most automobiles had only AM receivers in the car radios.
At that time, that's correct.
Wow. So FM was still to come into its day. And I wanted to bring that up because it's an interesting part of your story that we will get to in just a few minutes. So let's talk for a minute about how radio stations ran in those days. Today there's digital music, there's all kinds of things, but in those days you played records and had turntables. Let's talk about how radio stations worked in the 1960s.
Well, it was quite a bit different than what it is today. Of course, back then we had wire services, and the smaller stations would subscribe to whichever one was cost less.
News services, and there were two news services available to you at that time. Tell us what those were.
Associated Press, I believe, was one, and United Press International.
Yeah, and typically stations voted with their pocketbook.
That's right. The smaller stations, whichever one had this costed less for 1 year's a 1 year service, that's who you went with.
So you had two. Some stations had three turntables, and while one record, either a 45 or a 78, was playing music being broadcast over your stations, you were queuing up the other record as they weren't called disc jockeys yet, they were called
announcers.
Yes, you were
disc
hired.
jockeys that term came along some years later.
So the announcer would queue up the second record, and that way you could move from record to record with an intro into each one and make a very smooth radio show. And then what became known as, still in this genre today, rip and read, you had a teletype. How was that teletype connected to the news service and delivered the information to you?
Well, it was located in kind of a booth.
Yeah.
Where the noise wouldn't be so loud that it was all around.
But it was connected by a phone line.
Well, that's correct.
You were very dependent upon the phone companies.
You were, very much so.
And there was a bell that rang when a news story that was important came along.
That's right. It would be either like a bulletin or a flash.
Yeah.
And when you heard that, you need whoever was on duty, they needed to go there and get that as quickly as possible to put on the air.
So the regular news stories, they would be printed out, and of course you could hear the teletype machine going. But if it was a story, breaking news, as we hear in today's genre, or something important, there was a bell that rang that said, hey, come and see what's come over the teletype.
Absolutely.
And in fact, while you were at the station, you had your program director heard that bell and an urgent message, and he brought it over for you to look at.
Yeah, I was in my office at that time, which was only not very many feet from where the control room was. And his name was Ed Conway. And so I heard the sound that there was a flash or a bulletin. And I wasn't doing anything particularly at that time in my office, so I thought I'd walk in there and see what was going on.
Now let's tell people, this was November 22nd, 1963.
That's correct.
And what did the bulletin say?
Well, the bulletin was about JFK, the President of the United States, being assassinated.
Wow.
And when the program director got it, he looked at it and he kind of went numb in a way. And he wiped his brow and he turned and saw I was there, motioned to me, and so I came in and got the bulletin and went back to the adjoining studio and sat down in front of the mic.
Wow.
And that's when I read that bulletin about President Kennedy being assassinated.
My gosh. And those are moments that stay in your memory.
Oh, yeah. That's something
forever.
you'll never forget.
So let's kind of recap a little bit. As far as the economy after the war concluded, the economy went into a recession in 1959.
Correct.
And broadcast stations, radio stations, particularly in small markets, if retail business is down, they don't buy as much advertising.
Right.
So the radio station's business was down, and you had mentioned before the owners had come in. And a prominent Eastern North Carolina family, in fact, owned the radio stations.
That's correct.
And was it Coastal Plains Broadcasting
Yeah,
Company?
Coastal Plains Broadcasting Company.
And tell us about the family that owned it.
The family that owned it was V.E. Fountain, Benton Fountain, and his brother, R.M. Fountain. They owned the radio stations, and their other brother was Congressman L.H. Fountain.
Very prominent family here.
Yeah, they were,
Yeah.
and a very good group of people. And so they owned the radio station when I was employed there.
Wow. Well, it's nice to work for quality people, and the Fountains were.
Right.
They were top-notch people in the community, and they ran a good ship in all the businesses that they had. So what a great opportunity for you.
That's absolutely correct.
As radio stations in small markets went along and the economy improved, you look for new opportunities. And of course, you could hear some of the larger markets, Raleigh and Greensboro and Charlotte, and they were doing some things that small market stations started doing. I think it's really fascinating the way that you started doing some remote broadcasts. Tell us about taking out the tape recorder and doing remote broadcasts and how that worked.
Well, back at that time, it was probably monetarily wise, not wise. You couldn't get lines to go out to like stock farmers.
It wasn't economically feasible to have a telephone line installed for an event.
Particularly out where there was a stock sale and farmers things going on, which was way out from town.
Which means you couldn't connect live.
That's right. So what we do is we take a tape recorder and go out and interview farmers, and there was very much interesting stuff for farmers to listen to on the radio, something they want to know about. So we would interview them on the tape recorder, and one of my guys that also worked at the radio station would send it back to the station to play.
So you had a runner.
So we had them going back and forth on the company car while I was staying there interviewing people.
So you would do the interviews. You had several different tapes. Once that interview was done, that tape was given to the station person with the car. They'd take it back to the station, play it. Here we are at the livestock show. You wouldn't say live necessarily, but you would have that interview. And in the meantime, you were recording another one. And
that's correct.
You kept driving them back to the station all day long so that you actually were doing a, live to tape interview and providing very pertinent information to your listeners.
Yes, particularly farmers.
Absolutely. And farm crops are king in eastern North Carolina.
Absolutely.
So that was a big part of your audience. I think that's interesting. Something else that you got into that everybody takes for granted these days, and that is you got into play-by-play sports, and you were the play-by-play sports announcer at the station. Not only were you the general manager, and you sold time, and you went out and did interviews for the live to tape to play for remote broadcasts. In addition to the many, many things you did, you started doing play-by-play with high school athletics.
I did. I did play-by-play basketball and play-by-play football. Primarily, and was one of the first that did play-by-play basketball and football at WCPS-AM and FM. Of course, most of this was on FM.
So you used the FM because people didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
So the AM, which is our bread and butter, that's our big signal that everybody listens to. Well, let's put those sports over on the FM side because we don't, we just simulcast our signal, but that gives us two opportunities, a revenue opportunity, and people will turn to the FM that normally might not. So you created some great revenue opportunities.
Yeah. See, WCPS then, that was the daylight only station, the AM.
Okay.
So actually it was sun up to sundown.
Uh-huh.
So your FM had to be the one to do anything past sunset.
So Bob, now tell us, what was the power of the AM station at that time?
Well,
was it 1,000-watt daytime?
Pardon?
Was it 1,000-watt daytime?
I believe that's right.
Yeah. I was thinking that was it.
Yep.
And the FM went a little further, maybe.
Oh, yeah. It actually it ended up that the owners were they were very smart in going on, because FM back then meant frequency modulation and forget money, because it didn't make money. But they had the presence of thoughts as well. Let's hang on to that FM station, maybe something to develop later. Of course, FM
let's go back.
later was the real money maker.
So FM, you said the two acronyms were frequency modulation
and forget money.
And in fact, a lot of FMs, people sometimes played classical music. That was a popular format.
Oh yes, it
for
was.
many.
Yeah.
But you simulcast both, but started doing play-by-play sports. There were some problems, though. Sports teams in high school were not as well organized, and sometimes you didn't have all the names of all the players. If you were doing a play-by-play of the game for Tarboro High School playing Rocky Mount or something like that, what happened when you didn't know who was on the field?
Well, that's when you would invent a name. And being a history buff and reading a lot and everything, I would come up with some names of my favorite authors or something. And so if I didn't know the guy's name, I might call him Scotty Fitzgerald for F. Scott Fitzgerald, the author, or Ernie Hemingway for Ernest Hemingway, the other author.
So number 10, Ernest Hemingway just took the ball down the field, but you weren't quite sure who number 10 was.
Yeah, well, I called him Ernie. And so some of the audience, I'm sure, picked up and knew what was going on, and some of them probably thought I was intoxicated.
Oh, but you weren't.
No.
Well, we will believe that story. Okay. Right. Well, that's very interesting. And I think, these are how small market radio stations worked.
That's correct.
And small market radio made up a huge population of broadcasters in North Carolina, and is the history and how things developed in the broadcasting business in our state to what it is today. Now that that's been said, everything was live pretty much. You had some tape recorders you used, but a lot of the commercials were live. The rip and reads were live. Right. Sometimes there were bloopers.
That's when we made a mistake, a goof, we called them bloopers.
Yeah.
And if anybody did enough live broadcasting, sooner or later you will mix bloopers.
I agree with that. Can you remember any that were memorable?
I can. I don't know if everybody wants to hear it or not.
Oh, well, go ahead and tell us. This interview will be streamed, so we might not do it on a TV version. Yeah.
I can remember one where I believe I had the football game, and the guy that caught the ball, and I had him catching it somewhere around the 15-yard line on up to the 20, 25, the 30, to 40. And I had him being tackled on the 52-yard line. No such thing. but it was going too fast for me to change gears at the 50-yard line. So I got a lot of ribbon from that.
Oh, gosh.
And the editor of the newspaper here, the Daily Southerner back then, was his name was Mabry Bass. And a lot of times newspaper and radio people, they look at each other as competitors and don't get along that well. That was not true with us. Mabry and I were really good friends. But he got a kick out of that, and when we had our office Christmas party, he showed up with a clothesline with 52-yard line tag on it. And I looked at it and I said, okay, that shows that it exists. And so that's what happened on the 52-yard line. Of course, there were a lot of other bloopers too. I think I had one.
We had one with a retail store, Dick Jackson's.
Oh yeah, Dick Jackson, the live commercial, and that you read it live. It was not when you can tape it and you make an error, you can go back and change the tape.
Yeah.
But you can't when it's live; it's gone.
Yep.
And I believe I had Bruce Jackson, and I believe the thing said something about grab your hat and go down to Bruce Jackson's for such and
Dick
such.
Jackson's.
Yeah. And I came out and said, grab your dick and go down to Bruce.
You did it backwards.
I did it backwards.
Yeah.
And I kept talking.
Yeah.
I did have enough sense to keep talking and hope that nobody heard exactly what I said.
Yeah, I can understand
But I
that.
found out later a friend of mine was at home listening to the radio, and he was laying on his couch, and when he heard that, he rolled off, fell on the floor, and yelled out, well, Harper won't have that job very long. Thankfully, he was wrong in that.
Well, I'm glad about that too. Small market radio was live. It involved creativity. You had to be analytical. And North Carolina was dotted with lots of small market radio broadcasters, including you, Bob Harper, running an AM and an FM station. And there was a great resource for small market, all radio stations, television stations, an association, the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters.
Correct.
Tell us about your involvement with them. What's the first event that you attended? Do you recall?
I don't recall the exact date. No,
Yeah.
That goes back a little bit beyond my memory.
Yeah.
But the station belonged to the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters, and so I went to one of the first meetings there.
They were a member. The station was a member.
Yeah, the station was already a member.
Okay.
Not very active, but we were a member.
Yeah.
As most North Carolina stations, I believe, were. And so I went to the first one, I think, with the salesperson that was with me at that time. And I wanted to, since I was going to make radio broadcasting a full-time, I believed a full-time career,
Yeah.
I wanted to learn everything I could about it. And this was one of the sources that I would be able to do that. So I went to the meeting and was welcomed, and everything went well, except I think one time I may have written about this, and I don't know if this was the first time I went, but maybe the second time, where some of the sponsors were given free cocktails. And so if you wanted a cocktail, it's free. And so naturally I had to have a cocktail.
Pretty powerful, that word free.
Yeah, and normally I never have but 2 or 3 anyway, and but it was free. And so the next thing I know, I was pretty well whipped.
Yeah.
And that's when I went back and got in the telephone booth and called back home and spoke with my wife, Judy. And she could tell immediately that I had had a little bit too much to drink. And so she gave me some good advice. She said, Bob, go to bed. And so that's what I did. And that never happened again, but it did happen that night.
Well, and the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters and their executive director, Wade Hargrove.
Yes.
And you became great friends and a great resource for your station, as well as your personal development as a manager of the Coastal Plains broadcasting stations.
Yeah, I met Wade, I forget, maybe the second or third time that I was there, and we immediately became good friends. And I still consider him one of my best friends. We stay in contact some with telephone or email, and I'm thinking he's probably got something to do with me this going on right now.
And you became involved with NCAB at a little higher level. You became a member of their board of directors.
That's correct.
And in 1972, you became president of NCAB.
Yeah, I was vice president for radio in between that,
Yep.
and then I was elected president of the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters.
And back then, they had elections.
Back then.
To see who was president.
That's right. Back then, the theory was that if we run two good people against each other, then no matter who wins, you'll have a good leader.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's true, but the problem there is that whoever lost may not want to run again and lose again.
Yeah.
And that was not a good thing, because both of those leaders, both of them would have made good leaders.
Quality people. Do you remember who you ran against?
Yeah, and so that was later changed, and it was a good thing they changed it. But back at that time, I had to run against other candidates from different places.
And was the person that you ran against the year you ran, was that Bill Rollins?
I believe it was.
Yes.
Yeah, for president it was.
Yeah, and I think there was a one vote difference. I think it was tied.
It was the first time, I believe, in
Yeah.
NCAB history that it was a tie.
But then
tie.
nobody lost, because 2 years later, Bill became the president of NCAB.
That's correct.
And everyone benefited from that.
But we had to have, they had to
nominate.
re-vote.
Yeah.
And on the second ballot,
You
I
won
won,
that
I
time.
think, by one
One
vote.
vote? Yeah, wow. That's impressive.